obrigada pela vossa paciência. Em particular, um grande obrigada ali ao professor Boaventura Sousa Santos, que tem estado aqui na sala, aceitando um pouco este atraso que o programa já vai, mas eu acho que é para nós um enorme orgulho termos este pequeno momento aqui com o Johny Pitts. Eu vou apresentá-lo em português e ele continuará depois em inglês. Este livro é um livro que, na verdade, o que importa também é que o já está. Este livro é o livro, antes de mais, de um fotógrafo. Johny Pitts é fotógrafo, trabalhou também noutras áreas da comunicação, nomeadamente em televisão, colaborou com vários canais de televisão, é neste momento colaborador da BBC, também do canal RT. É um editor de uma das plataformas mais influentes, penso eu, da cultura afro-europeia no momento, Afropean Adventures in Black Europe, que muitos de vocês com certeza conhecem para se manter a par de uma agenda, nomeadamente cultural europeia, e fez uma longa viagem, como ele próprio explica na apresentação deste livro, de Lisboa a Moscovo, passando por Paris e Estocolmo, visitando um conjunto de comunidades negras ou afrodescendentes na Europa. Um dos pontos dessa viagem, penso mesmo que um dos pontos iniciais dessa viagem foi Lisboa, Cova Da Moura, e por isso faz para nós imenso sentido tê-lo aqui. Faz também muito sentido porque, sendo um livro de viagem, é de certa forma um livro de inversão do olhar que geralmente foi lançado sobre o mundo, um olhar branco que fez do outro o exótico, o estranho ou o perigoso. E, portanto, o Johny Pitts calçou os sapatos do viajante e foi-se pôr a olhar para o mundo a partir da sua história negra, mas também afro-europeia ou Afropean, como ele prefere dizer. E, por isso, sem demoras, vou passar a palavra ao Johny Pitts e vou também reunir-me a vocês, porque eu também quero olhar para estas belíssimas fotos. Obrigada, Johny, por teres vindo. Muito obrigada mesmo por estares a lançar aqui o livro antes mesmo de ele sair em Londres para a semana.
Obrigado. Thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to thank Teresa. As anyone who actually decides to read the book will see, Teresa is a real has been a real ally, and she's in my acknowledgement section. I'm very thankful to the work that she's doing here, opening up important conversations in this beautiful city. So I'll talk for maybe 20 minutes and show some photographs, and then maybe we can have a discussion. Apologies that this is in English and for the Anglophone cultural hegemony that I'm bringing into this room with me. I'll start by reading the opening couple of paragraphs from my Lisbon chapter. The well-thumbed, out-of-date Lonely Planet guide in the lounge of my Lisbon hostel as I waited to be checked in read, "Imagine you were given a blank canvas to paint a city. First, the backdrop, cobalt skies, 7 hills, a different view for each day of the week, a blue splash for the river. Now for the details. Candy-bright houses, twisting alleys, grand plazas where locals relax in the sunshine. It's beautiful but lacks icons, so you had a likeness of San Francisco Suspension Bridge, swirly Manueline turrets, ivory white domes, and, as an afterthought, a Moorish castle on the hillside. Perfect. Now stand back and observe your masterpiece, Lisbon." I wanted to add, of course, funding all this will be a problem. So let's have a splash of forced labour and begin a transatlantic slave trade followed by and overlapping with centuries of ruthless colonialism. Oh, and how about an unofficial favela-like settlement with its own underground economy, where we can shunt away the families and descendants of cheap Cape Verdean labourers? Lisbon may be a masterpiece, but look closer at those broad brushstrokes and you'll find some troubling details. So I'd like to go into reading some of my introduction to the book. I start with a quote by Amin Malouf from a beautiful book called On Identity. "They live in a sort of frontier zone crisscrossed by ethnic, religious and other fault lines. But by virtue of this situation, peculiar rather than privileged, they have a special role to play in forging links, eliminating misunderstandings, making some parties more reasonable and others less belligerent. And that's precisely why their dilemma is so significant. If they themselves cannot sustain their multiple allegiances, if they're continually pressed to take sides, then all of us have reason to be uneasy about the way the world is going. When I first heard it, it encouraged me to think of myself as whole and unhyphenated, Afropean. Here was a space where blackness was taking part in shaping European identity at large. It suggested the possibility of living in and with more than one idea, Africa and Europe, or by extension, the global South and the West, without being mixed this or half that or black other. That being black in Europe didn't necessarily mean being an immigrant. Labels are invariably problematic, often provocative, but at their best they can sing something into visibility. From my timid vantage point, growing up in a working class area of Sheffield in the UK, ravaged by the external forces of free market economics and the internal protective force of local insularity that took shape in post-Code Wars, where each area with its own zip code would fight with each other. I began to notice a world that had been invisible to me before, or at the very least implausible. In my small corner of Britain, I had felt I was being forced to react against one culture or to over-identify with the other. Originally coined in the early 1990s by David Byrne and Belgian Congolese artist Marie Dawn, frontwoman of music group Zap Mama, I first encountered this notion of Afropean in the realms of music and fashion. Among many others, Les Nubians from Soul Sisters from Chad by way of France exuded it, as did Nena Cherry, whose roots are Swedish and Sierra Leonean, Joy Denalane from South Africa via Germany, and Claude Grunitzky's Trace publication. Transcultural styles and ideas was the magazine's tagline and reflected Grunitzky's own Afropean identity. He had a Polish grandfather on his mother's side, was born in Togo, raised in Paris, and launched his magazine in London. This was a very attractive scene that I was tapping into. Beautiful, talented, successful black Europeans, effortlessly articulating their cultural influences in coherent and creative ways. It was particularly attractive to me because the sense was that this iteration of blackness existing in Europe appeared as if it wasn't going to be going anywhere anytime soon. It felt closer to home than the sometimes overbearing African American art forms, and more encompassing and nuanced than the Black Britain Club, whose sense of itself was starting to feel outdated, often packaged exclusively as an embodiment of the Windrush generation. And in fact, in the last national UK census, for the first time, more black Britons identified themselves as black African than Afro-Caribbean. Initially then, I saw this term Afropean as something of a utopian alternative to the doom and gloom that has surrounded the black image in Europe in recent years, and an optimistic route forward. I wanted to work on a project that connected and presented Afro-Europeans as lead actors in our own story, and with all this glorious Afropean imagery in mind, I imagined this would result in some kind of coffee table photo book with snippets of feel-good text to accompany a series of trendy portraits. There would be images of the success stories of Black Europe, young men and women whose street style effortlessly and elegantly articulated an empowered Black European mood. It was a visit to the so-called jungle in Calais in 2016 that encouraged me to reconsider this approach. Over some milky Arabic tea, Hisham, a young man from Sudan who ran one of many small, remarkably organised cafes and had been living in the jungle for 10 months, told me how he'd lost everything. He had no surviving family members, painful memories of the past and tremulous visions of the future, and was stuck in this limbo land between Africa and Europe. Home, a little of which he'd miraculously fashioned in his cushion-covered cafe and anonymity. As I left his creaking plywood premises, he suggested that I write about his story and about life in the jungle, a request I was a little bit nervous about. This man was intelligent, articulate and literate. Wouldn't it be better that he write about the jungle himself? Maybe I could attract attention to his writing or publish his story on the website that I run. But what did I personally know about seeing friends massacred, fleeing war, hiding for my life in shipping containers or on ill-equipped boats to arrive penniless at a bunch of cold, windswept shacks in the hinterlands of northern France, apart from what he was telling me? After exchanging contact details, I left the jungle on my bicycle and slowly realised I was being watched and followed through the streets of Calais by the French military police, the gendarmerie. Attempting to enter the white gates of the port to catch my ferry back to the UK, I was stopped and searched and asked for my ID, where I was going, where I'd come from, how long I'd been away, and why. Finally, after more questioning and looks of suspicion, I was allowed to enter an official compound I'd seen other brown-skinned men of my age look longingly at from a distance. I was in, and they were out. Unlike the people I met in the jungle, I wasn't living in limbo as much as living with liminality. I was in because I had ID. I had ID because I was born and raised in Britain, had a history connected to Europe, knew how things ran. And yet within this piece of geography, this idea of Europe, I was frequently reminded I wasn't all the way in. One Remembrance Day, a day I've come to dread for the way it spikes, ugly nationalism, which I sometimes find myself on the receiving end of, I was hit with that old chestnut and told to go back to where I came from by a middle-aged man, red-faced with rage and racism. My skin colour had disguised various facts, such as my grandfather having fought for Britain behind enemy lines in the Second World War and winning a medal for doing so. My skin had disguised my Europeanness. European was still being used as a synonym for white. If Afropean was something that could attempt to address this issue, I needed to find out what lay behind or beyond its brand. A brand black spun and authored, yes, but that's all this was for now. A pleasant idea that was being sold to me and involved PR companies, stylists, fashion photographers and art direction. In Britain, it was this sort of vision of corporate multiculturalism, this veneer of inclusion that Tony Blair's New Labour had used in an attempt to make Britain appear international, open-minded, forward-thinking and ready for business in the global economy, without affecting policies for long-term change in the way Britain treated its immigrants. Did Afropean only include beautiful, economically successful and often light-skinned black people? Afropean as aspiration was one thing, but as I was writing about an interplay between black and European cultures, I realised this utopian vision of a black European experience would mean willfully ignoring reality shared by a majority of people living in Europe. It would mean making the numerous groups of unemployed black men I saw at train stations, or the African women cleaning toilets, or the disenfranchised communities struggling in the hinterlands of cities completely invisible. It also seemed disingenuous to leave out my own culturally rich, if also unglamorous, experience of growing up black in Britain, and how it felt to travel Europe as somebody who identifies as black. It became apparent that I should let the reader know where I was coming from in order that they might better understand where I was heading. That is, the under-documented areas of Europe that often contradict the homogenized, monocultured depictions suggested by tourist boards and pocket-sized travel guides. At this point, I'd like to read another small section from my Lisbon chapter, if that's okay. So this is, I'm going to talk about entering Cova Da Moura with two people, somebody who was a youth worker, he's a former gang member who turned into a youth worker called Jacare, and he took me into Cova Da Moura. In it, as well, I want to address something that I think bothers me about Lisbon and probably bothers a lot of people currently living in Lisbon, the sort of the new tech and tourist boom. Okay. Okay, so here I'm with Nino, who'd explained to me that I would be okay in Cova Da Moura because I didn't look Angolan, and that there was some issues between the Cape Verdean community and the Angolan community. After a tour around the impressive centre of the bluff of a hill, we looked out at some of the depressing tenement buildings, suspended in the hazy pollution of a dimming sky. They were the same ones we'd passed on the way to Cova Da Moura. Avelino turned to me and lamented, once they were areas just like Cova Da Moura, but now they've been demolished and replaced by these. I asked if what Jacare had told me was true, that even if given the chance to live in a modern building, the inhabitants would want to stay where they were. He said, when people first came here, they had no land, no money, no rights, so they tried their best to recreate the home they knew in Cape Verde. Not because they didn't want to fit in with Lisbon, but because they couldn't. He looked down at the lifeless concrete high-rises. If they raised Cova Da Moura, it would destroy our community. And that is what we have here, a real community. And the government can't afford to rehouse enough people anyway. Cova Da Moura is here to stay. We can even receive post, but only by certain postmen, of course. When slums that have been organically grown by the community over time are destroyed, the natural logic of the place, which has been nurtured for decades, is also destroyed. The DIY system of networks, commerce, social spaces, and what cartographers might call subaltern geospatial intelligence, the innate unofficial understanding of how to move through and thrive within a space built upon years of local homegrown knowledge. Surely there was a way to invest in these communities in a way that didn't crop them so severely. Avelino had mentioned that Cova Da Moura's future was secure, but in a leaflet he handed me, published by the centre he worked for, I read a different story, and one in which the future didn't at all sound so certain. It read, the neighbourhood was constructed illegally in the late 1970s in the Lisbon metropolitan area. The houses were built by the people who still live here now. It's a place where a sense of a proper good way of life is growing stronger and stronger, and the concurrent desire to combat the image of poverty, crime and social exclusion that have been associated with the area. At the same time, and because it's situated near Lisbon, the area has been coveted by real estate speculation with real threat to the neighbourhood. When you combine this information with a recent article entitled The 6 Cities We Want to Move to in 2017 in the high-end men's fashion journal, Mr. Porter, the displacement of those living in Cova Da Moura is a real concern. It reads, cheap rents, solid tech infrastructure such as fast fibre broadband and healthy venture capital mean the city of Seven Hills is entering a new golden age. Labour costs are approximately a third lower than Berlin, which means startups can now be found in grand 16th century palazzos that were built when Lisbon was the richest city on earth, or in the vast industrial neighbourhoods along the Tagus River. That's what's happening all over the world, isn't it? An educated elite can work remotely from home or use dad's capital to start up a business in a new territory, with a compliant government encouraging commerce and capital which only in small ways would benefit the local working classes and in many ways might crush them. In Cova Da Moura there was a sense of community. People worked together. Everybody knew everybody and looked out for each other in a way that was impossible in the high-rise outposts of other big cities. I'll end there. This brings me back to where I grew up, which is, it's not exactly like Cova Da Moura, but it was on the outskirts of the city of Sheffield and wasn't part of the official narrative of Sheffield. In 1948, the same year he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, T.S. Eliot penned a famous and influential work of non-fiction called Notes Towards the Definition of Culture, in which he wrote, "What is culture? Culture may be described simply as that which makes life worth living, and it's what justifies other peoples and other generations in saying, when they contemplate the remains and the influence of an extinct civilization, that it was worthwhile for that civilization to have existed." Eliot encompassed a view that much of Britain and Europe believed to be true at that time, that culture was colonial, conjured at the imagined top of society, which is to say by aristocracy, and that it was the duty of the upper classes to extol and disseminate the virtues of culture to the masses, that the spread of culture wasn't a two-way process, but only top-down. And yet T.S. Eliot's own definition of culture, that culture is something that makes life worth living, is evidenced by worthwhile people, didn't come from the top for me. The landscape that sustained my childhood as someone born black, northern and working class in Margaret Thatcher's Britain was constructed by what I've come to describe as the B-side. In 90s British urban music culture, very often underground music lovers would buy 12-inch records for the unofficial remixes or dubs offered on the B-side of a release rather than the official radio-friendly A-side. The notion of the unofficial, unpromoted, but sometimes more interesting alternative to the official is something that could be applied to the geography that surrounded the music. High-rise estates doubling as pirate radio stations and concrete canvases for graffiti artists. Barbershops selling bootleg mixtapes, terrace houses and blues party venues. Hinterland topographies hosting illegal street parties. These were the spaces that contained the pulse of black life in Sheffield, the city I was born and raised in. It was where you might find the type of multiculturalism that was antithetical to the pretty, corporate, commodified multiculti of New Labour. Organic, clandestine meeting spaces for those of us living on the B-side of Britain, with little chance of ever being documented properly. By the time I'd turned 25, the landscape that sustained my childhood had all been demolished or gentrified. It was as though it had never existed. And I began to realise that my great-great-great-grandkids, unless something truly catastrophic happens, will be able to stand on Waterloo Bridge and look at the same Houses of Parliament or St Paul's Cathedral as I can now. Landscapes can hold narratives, suggest identities, preserve cultures. Some cultural landscapes are better preserved than others. The view I was left with then, as I travelled around Black Europe looking for Black European landscapes, was something of a sullied utopia, a place of struggle and hope, of high drama and quiet nuance, of conclusions and ambiguity, connections and disjuncture, but always there was humour and humanity in my encounters and interactions. To paraphrase the American poet Robert Frost, my quarrel with this continent is a lover's quarrel. I've travelled extensively across the planet, including West Africa, where my blackness is rooted, and Brooklyn, that hotbed of black culture that has infinitely inspired me, and where my father was born. And still nowhere else feels quite as much as like home as Europe. I was taught how to read and write here, not always the right things necessarily, but I speak its languages, engage in some of its customs, and make use of the intricate and sometimes faded beauty of its old architecture, the museums and galleries, often in existence thanks to the blood and toil of black men and women under exploitative empires. As Martinican poet and politician Aimé Césaire wrote beautifully, I tell myself Bordeaux and Nantes and Liverpool and New York and San Francisco, not 1 inch of this world doesn't bear my digital imprint and my calcaneum on the back of skyscrapers and my squalor in the sparkle of gems. As a member of Europe's black community, this Europe that I speak of is all part of my inheritance too. And it was time to wander and celebrate the continent like I owned it. A continent that has frequently, to quote Césaire's protégé Frantz Fanon, woven me out of 1,000 details, anecdotes and stories. A Europe that, as I would see, was populated by Egyptian nomads, Sudanese restaurateurs, Swedish Muslims, black French militants, Belgian Congolese painters. A continent of Cape Verdean barrackers, Algerian flea markets, Surinamese shamanism, German reggae and Moorish castles. All this was part of Europe too. And these were areas that needed to be fully understood and fully embraced if Europe wanted to have fully functional societies. And black Europeans too need to understand Europe and to demand our participation in its societies, to demand the right to document and disseminate our stories. And finally, to those who are used to privilege, equality can seem like oppression. And such people might ask, so where is the European part in this Afropean? in the same way that people might ask why such a thing as Black History Month exists in Britain but not White History Month. This is like asking why London has a Chinatown but not an England town. England and whiteness are so omnipresent they can seem invisible. White history isn't projected as white history because it is simply history. It dominates TV shows and curricula and surrounds us constantly. I wrote in a European language, travelled through European streets and grappled constantly with European history, though it's true that I'm not an anthropologist or historian. I'm a writer and photographer and a black citizen living in Europe now. And this journey was an attempt at making sense of that. With my brown skin and my British passport, still a free ticket into mainland Europe at the time of writing. One cold October morning, I set out in search of the Afropeans, and by the end of my journey, I was standing in Gibraltar. I'd travelled across from Marseille to Lisbon, and then from Lisbon to Gibraltar, where you can stand on the shores of Europe and see the coastline of Africa. And I suppose the reason I wanted to end my journey there is because I saw something allegorical. I saw that this idea, the proximity of the two places that I call home next to each other. But that day when I ended my journey, it was terrible weather, and it was so foggy, and I could barely see a couple of meters in front of me, and never mind across the straits to Africa. But in that moment, as the surf spritzed my face, I closed my eyes and I realised that Africa was right where I was stood, and I had the photographic evidence to prove it. I'd met black communities and been sustained by black communities that had many commonalities. And so I looked out at Africa one more time that was shrouded by mist, and then turned around to this continent called Europe that I've been born and raised in, and I went back to where I came from. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having agreed to present your book in Lisbon even before you launch it in London. And I'm sure it would be great to have a conversation after looking at such wonderful pictures, but we are really late in our program, so perhaps 1-2 questions maximum, and then I would suggest that the conversation with John would go on outside after our program in a more relaxed environment. But if there is one question for Johny, please.
Hi, my name is Raquel. We have been exchanging emails concerning the International Afropeans Conference.
Oh, yes,
I
great.
have to leave soon, so I'm going to give you a question now.
Okay.
Which is, you've talked about this, which is very interesting, about how this segregated zone is not in communication with all the marketing about the cities, all the idea of gentrified cities such as Lisbon with this touristification that is happening, and concerning all these suburbs and these peripheric areas and how they utilize these bodies and these subjectivities. My question is, how do you feel it happens in the same, not the same way, but very close, regarding academia and all the activism and arts where you found the base of your work? Because you say that Afropean is a concept that you start by saying through Zapata and Erica when using videos, photos, etc. And when it comes to the academia and the way it is institutionalized, sometimes it's difficult to understand who is really controlling the narrative and who, for what objective. And how do you feel that your work can accumulate wider struggle with activism through this path of academia? And how academia can benefit or work with these other areas without desvirtualizing this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a really
Bunch of questions.
that's a really important point to make. I would, the first thing I would say is that this is not an academic work at all. It's completely outside of the academy. It was self-funded, and actually the publishing deal came after the book, the first draft, was written, and then I got the publishing deal. So it's completely independent, and I set off without anybody trying to frame my political goals or my agenda. That was really important to me. Now, the second thing is that I'm published by one of the biggest publishing houses in the world, which is, on the one hand, a great thing because more people get to see it, and another, in another way, it's problematic because who am I talking to? Who will really be able to afford this book's £20? I couldn't control how much the book is how much So to answer your question, what's important for me is in the promotion of the book, and and it's important for me to extract the content from the book and make sure it enters the spaces that I've been traveling. It's important for me to link with the areas that I've been talking about in the book. This is what we have planned. We have a tour planned in all the areas that I visited in the book. And actually, we got some funding. I'll be working with somebody called Shamila Bismahoun, who I'll be working with a group called Benin City, and we'll be taking the ideas from this book and we'll be performing the book to make it take part in what I guess is like an African oral tradition. Oh, you know Joshua? Great. Oh, brilliant. That's great. Yeah, so he's really cross with me at the moment because I've been working on this book, but we need to work together, so we're going to put some time together, but so that it's going to be music, and we're going to take all the themes from the book and perform it for free, and that to me is really important. It's important that I don't either preach to the converted or exclude the people. I mean, the people from where I grew up. It's so important that I reach out to the people that I'm trying to represent.
John, thank you so much for presenting the book here with us today. And again, I think John will be around. He will be with us at the end of the afternoon.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think we should take a break now, a very short break. Thank you very much to Professor Boaventura Sousa Santos for waiting patiently that we end our sessions. So a very brief break, and we come in to listen to Professor Boaventura Sousa Santos. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your concentration. Thank you, Teresa. That's great.